Good morning, beloveds. And welcome to Bellingham Unitarian Fellowship. I am indeed the Reverend Dr. Barbara Wells Tenhove, and for about the next 30 minutes or so, am serving as your sabbatical minister. As you may have noticed, our minister, Paul Beckel, and his absolutely fabulous wife, Jane, have returned to us. And today's worship service celebrates the work we've all done during this sabbatical time. Shortly, we will welcome Paul back in what we're calling a ritual of return. And this ritual reflects the ritual of release we gave to Paul when he left on sabbatical on December 19th. We have come full circle. And though much has changed in these 4 months that Paul's been on sabbatical, the affection we feel for our minister has not. I am very glad Paul is back among us. And I know you are too. And I admit to feeling a bit wistful as I leave this position and gently ease my way back into the congregation. Moments like this, when we say hello and goodbye, are poignant. And worship services are a wonderful way to honor and acknowledge such feelings. So I'm glad we're here together in person and on Zoom to honor this transition. So let's take a moment to reflect on all the feelings swirling amongst us as we listen to Andrea play Prelude No. 5 in G by Robert Vandal.
Thank you, Andrea. Before we proceed with the chalice lighting, I think we need to acknowledge that one of the things that this transition does is that we no longer have Jocko for musical accompaniment. So we...
Just temporarily.
Okay, temporarily. Good. All right. But he sort of came joined at the hip every week, and so we're going to miss that.
You'll be back.
Good. When my wife and I, Liz, were new parents, I was working on a project for a large Japanese software company. And it meant that I had to spend a certain amount of time in Japan. I tried to, because we were new parents and we had a toddler, I tried to restrict those trips to a week at a time. It meant, though, that I was spending enough time flying across the Pacific that the United Airlines Pacific cabin crews knew me by first name. But there came a point later on in the project where I had to be in Japan for 2 weeks. I left cassette tapes with bedtime stories for Alexandra Catherine and pictures and little notes that Liz could dispense to her during that time. When I finally got back to Los Angeles with a suitcase full of dirty laundry, I came down the ramp from the customs shed at Los Angeles Airport and was met by a dashing ball of energy screaming, "Daddy, Daddy, Daddy!" And she grabbed me around the knees like a leech and would not let go. I handed my suitcase to Liz and pried Allie loose and picked her up and carried her to the car, and everything was copacetic until we got home. Once she got across the threshold of the house, things changed. She turned around, she planted herself, waited until I stepped through the doorway, and slugged me. And she said, "You were gone too long." As Barbara lights our chalice today, in honor of all returns, let's acknowledge the occasional mixed emotions that come from those transitions. Please join me in reciting our covenant. Love is the spirit of this fellowship, and service gives it life. Celebrating our diversity and joined by a quest for truth, we work for peace and honor all creation. This is our covenant. And each week, we pass the basket to collect your offering in support of the good work of Buff. Your contributions in the basket or by one of the methods shown on your Zoom screen, as well as your regular annual pledges, keep us operating. They keep the lights on, they keep the building heated, they pay the mortgage and our staff, and they support our outreach programs like Humanitas. As Andrea plays some Mendelssohn for us, the ushers will come forward to accept the weekly offering. Thank you all for your continuing generosity.
Thank you, Andrea, and thanks to all of you for your generosity in support of this beloved congregation. When I began my work with you as sabbatical minister in December of 2021, it was winter. The Omicron wave was peaking, and the holiday season was unfolding in strange ways as we continue to figure out how to do worship and church in the midst of an ongoing pandemic. Thanks to Paul and the Buff leadership, we wisely made the decision not to go back to virtual-only church. And though our attendance was modest, the brave act of meeting in person kept the energy of this church going strongly as people adjusted to Paul's absence and my presence. While 4 months can feel like a very long time, we all know it isn't, at least not really. And yet for me, these 4 months gave me an opportunity to witness the many gifts this congregation has, something I really wasn't able to do fully from my perch as a retired minister sitting in the pew, as I've done for the past 5 years. So let me say a few words about the lessons I've learned from being your minister, albeit very part-time and for a brief moment in your history during Paul's sabbatical. As you have heard me say from this pulpit, I was raised Unitarian Universalist, and my father was a minister. I became a minister when I was 25 years old. So counting my childhood churches, I have been a part of over a dozen congregations and connected in some fashion to many more during my nearly 62 years of life. Over my lifetime in our religion, I've learned that Unitarian Universalist churches are as unique as fingerprints and as similar. There's a quality to UU congregations that transcends location and leadership, something that hollers out to people who come in through the doors, that's a UU church and those are UU people. Some of you have probably had that experience. I certainly have. But within that framework, there is also a unique quality to each congregation that is worth noting. And having served as your minister for 4 months, I'd like to tell you a little bit of what I've learned about you during that time. It's good. What's the matter? You may remember a sermon where I said, that Buff is quirky. So I've already told you that, so we'll move on. So I'm going to say first that Buff believes in bold action. During Paul's sabbatical, not only did we decide to stay open when many UU churches dithered, we also continued to do the hard and inspiring work of accountability toward becoming a beloved community. While I did not participate actively in this process, watching from afar was inspiring. Doing much of the work via Zoom or in a hybrid space without Paul was difficult, to say the least. And yet the work happened, and Paul returns to a church much farther along in this challenging process than many in our association. And for that, you should be incredibly proud. You also, during this time, made a commitment to support an Afghan refugee family and raised over $10,000 from within this church and from outside it. And we also took an extra special collection to raise money for Ukraine that raised over $1,500. And this was on top of the regular monthly special collections that routinely raised $1,500. Wow, that's really something. Well, I admire boldness and generosity in religious life so much. I also admire kindness and caring, another facet of this congregation that shone brightly during Paul's sabbatical. As only your quarter-time minister, I didn't have time to provide pastoral care the way Paul does full-time. And the emergence of the pandemic created a curious challenge as people almost forgot how to ask for help and support and how to give it. Yet even with the pandemic a factor, during these past 4 months, Buff folks reached out and cared for each other with grace and kindness. I had a meeting about a month ago with your pastoral care team, and I was so impressed by the intention they brought to the work. People are here for each other, and that really matters. Another thing I want to hold up about Buff is its incredible staff. I've been fortunate throughout my long career to work with amazing staff members, and thankfully Buff was no exception. I had a backstage pass during Paul's sabbatical to the inner workings of Buff. Watching how Kevin, you have to look at me, Kevin, when I talk to you. Watching how Kevin gently but firmly brought the choir back to life after the pandemic hiatus was beautiful to behold. Experiencing the ways Genia cared for our families and created space for everyone who wanted to grow religiously was deeply meaningful. Now, she told me she would not be in this room, but seeing the ways Kathy kept the office running with such ease, even whilst dealing with a break-in, big changes like a new security system, and figuring out how to work with me was a blessing. So, yay to Kathy. And now back in the sound booth, there's Walt. You have to stand up, Walt. Watching Walt grow in his job, figuring out how to make us sound good in person and on Zoom while also moving or lifting or reaching things for me was kindness personified. And listening as Andrea and Melanie created beautiful music week after week, supporting worship services different in style than you were used to, allowed me to shine. Thank you. I am incredibly grateful to all of the Buff staff, and you should be too. Finally, let me say that Buff is a church that values ministry. When I took on this position, I had a feeling that was true, particularly as I saw the willingness that you had to grant Paul a sabbatical and the choice you made to hire me to guide the ship in his absence. But it became truly clear to me in the ways you've supported my work during these past 4 months. It wasn't always easy during the time you were away, Paul. We've dealt with some challenging things, like the break-in and the easing of pandemic restrictions with all that entailed. But never once did I feel my leadership questioned or my ministry unappreciated. People, you, beloveds, have thanked me regularly, said meaningful and kind things about worship services you enjoyed, have stood up to me occasionally and disagreed with me, have asked about my health and my energy, and reached out to me with kindness and caring. It makes me feel proud to call you my religious home. Thank you so very much. Thank you. People who are not connected to spiritual community may ask, why do we do this strange work of building community under a value-laden and religious umbrella? And my response is this: what we do here and are here really matters. Our Unitarian belief in the unity of all creation and our Universalist belief that love is at the heart of it all is powerfully and deeply religious. And during my time among you, I have witnessed you living out our faith in inspiring ways. In a moment, we will begin the dance that will lead Paul back up to his pulpit. But before that happens, let me just say once again, thank you. Thank you for being such a wonderful congregation and for letting me serve you in this way. I am deeply blessed. Thank you. Thank you. And now I invite the Phoenix Ensemble to join me on the chancel as we welcome Paul back into his pulpit. Was fun. Well, Paul, as you can probably tell, this congregation is eager to welcome you back into the church as our minister. We have missed you, and we're so glad you've come back to us. At this moment, we stand in a liminal space in between your being away and your being here. So let's all just take a moment to acknowledge this transition with gratitude. Let's just take a deep breath. Well, in your absence, I was tasked with leading this congregation as its sabbatical minister, and many others rose to the occasion. As I mentioned, the amazing Buff staff. But I also want to thank the lay leaders of this congregation who did so much to keep the ship sailing in your absence. In particular, the board and the celebrants worked above and beyond the call of duty. So if you are on the board or a celebrant, would you stand and be recognized now? And of course, there were so many different committees and groups in the church that did so much. If you are on a committee at Buff, would you stand and be recognized so we can thank you as well? When you went on sabbatical, Paul, you left the church not only in my hands, but in the hands of the sabbatical committee. They provided me with a listening ear and kept their fingers on the pulse of the congregation. I'd like to invite them to come forward now and join us on the chancel. Sue and Stephanie and Ellie, and Daria is in Spain and not able to be with us, so. Poor thing. Yeah.
Paul, the offering of a sabbatical to a minister of many years standing is a time-honored tradition within Unitarian Universalist congregations. We hope this season away from Buff gave you an opportunity to reflect, grow, read, relax, and make room for new things to blossom in your mind, heart, and spirit. We missed you during this time apart, and we hope you missed us. We're so glad to welcome you back home among us today. When you went on sabbatical on December 19th, you left your hat with us to remind us that you'd return to claim it. Over the past 4 months, we've often had your hat on the altar and bringing your spirit into the room. And we offer it back to you now in celebration of the many gifts we've all received during this sabbatical.
Thanks, it's not cold in here today, so I'm not gonna. Certainly over the time of the pandemic, there were many times that there was nobody else in here. There was so much support from the staff and volunteers behind the scenes, but didn't have the warmth that I have with all of your warm bodies here. So mostly I wore it in the social hall during lunch with Paul, Tuesdays at noon, which will start next week. But it is sometimes cold down there, so you might want a hat. And when I went in December, I took this banner with me, which you originally gave me when I began my ministry here 8 years ago. The banner has been hanging in my home office this winter, and I have looked at it with gratitude as it's a vivid reminder of how this city and its waters, where Jane and I swim, she dragged me into Bellingham Bay yesterday. And the mountains where we bike, and of course Buff, our beloved community, how they are so beautifully sewn together. I'm returning it now. It hangs in the conference room in celebration of the many gifts that we've all received during the sabbatical.
During your absence, with your blessing and support, we asked the Reverend Dr. Barbara Wells Tenhove to serve as our sabbatical minister. She has served us well during this time, and we thank her with joy for the many gifts we've received from her during this time. And we're going to offer some special words, and you can write on those 3x5 cards anything that you particularly have appreciated or want to thank her for. Ellie?
During the sabbatical, Barbara, you took interest in the process for opening Buff from COVID restrictions, a complex but necessary eventuality. with many points of view and the need for both sensitivity and good problem solving from leadership. With fresh energy, you did not avoid getting involved. You were clear-eyed, open, and positive about preparing and engaging Buff during this process, gently nudging the conversation forward. Barbara, I believe that you receive your courage from a basic optimism and patience with the discomfort of learning. You are not afraid to learn or to make mistakes, even as you learn.
Yeah, we have more.
I'm interrupting as a member of the staff. Jeannie and I, and Kathy particularly, we got you some things that start with C and some words that start with C. Thank you, Barbara, for your can-do attitude, your careful planning, your clear direction, and your community spirit. Here are some chocolates and a bouquet.
I like this mic better. I was so happy to hear you say this morning that you value boldness, because I had already written, Barbara, you have boldly brought your whole self to the table as our sabbatical minister. You have jumped into song and cabaret, threaded intentional steps through the shifting ground of COVID, and made us laugh as well as invoke deep contemplation in a voice as authentic as your favorite soulful hymns. Thank you, Barbara, for enriching our congregation with the deeply grounded faith that you embody.
I have a sense we could go on and on. As a part-time minister, while Paul has been gone, you have been focused and organized. Thank you for the ways your planning and attention to detail have made it easier for others to contribute to Sunday services, like this one today. Perhaps what has impressed me the most, however, is while you have been with us, your generosity of heart has also had boundaries. You have shown me that it is indeed possible and essential to do both, to give and set limits around giving. You have communicated clearly and lovingly what you can and cannot do, and I have learned a great deal from that healthy modeling. Thank you. So could we give her a round of applause?
Says, are you ready? Somebody says, are you ready?
What?
I think somebody has to say, are you ready?
Oh, yes, I have another part. We didn't practice this as much as usual.
Microphone.
I know. This one's better. Paul and Barbara, you are colleagues and friends and will remain so going forward. But it is now time for Paul to return to the pulpit and Barbara to the congregation. Paul, are you ready to return to the pulpit?
I am, and I'm glad to be among you.
Let me do my line here. Make sure that they're really willing. Members and friends, do you welcome Paul back from sabbatical and commit to working with him again going forward? And if so, please say we will. We will!
Thank you. And thank you, Barbara. Without your help, I would not have known how to prepare myself or prepare the congregation for this time away. And while I was gone, I would have been so worried about things going wrong in my absence. But instead, I was able to really let go. And And I'm really grateful to be coming back into smooth waters. And I know that you've created some simpler ways of doing things that will make my life easier. And I very much appreciate that.
And Paul, I want to give you back your keys, which you entrusted to me when I took on this role. By returning them, I release this ministry back to you.
Thank you. Thank you.
So Barbara, are you ready to return to your honored place in the congregation
I am.
as you end your sabbatical? Well,
I am.
yes, well, that's wonderful. So thank you for all that you've done, and I want to kick this off to the Phoenix Choir next.
Okay, I got 4 months worth of this stuff, so it might come out, you know. Somewhere in this world, a loving but insistent and kind of aggravated voice was calling out, "Honey, come on, it's almost 9 o'clock, get out of bed." "Oh, please," was the response. "I'm tired and it's the weekend." "Yes, it is the weekend. It's Sunday and we're going to church in person. So get up and take a shower for once." Do I really have to go back there again? We're going to church? Oh, the sermons are so boring there. And nobody likes me. Well, I'm not going to argue with you about any of those things, but you're the minister and sabbatical is over. Now get your butt out of bed. What I would primarily like to say today is thank you. It is really is a joy to see you. Over the past couple of weeks, I have attended several Buff meetings. I've been reading old newsletters and sermons and financial reports and board minutes and getting updates from Barbara and the staff and volunteers. And what I've learned is that Buff is, you are, a very capable and mutually supportive congregation. I see that there have been challenges and unpleasant surprises, some difficult decisions to make, concerns you have had about one another's well-being, and many hours of listening and planning and collaborating and cleaning up after yourselves. Kind of the ordinary stuff of congregational life behind the scenes. And there's also been a lot of music making and gathering in person, and generous responses to the annual pledge drive. There's been ongoing engagement in the congregation-wide accountability audit, as Barbara mentioned, through which we're asking ourselves, what is actually coming? of our good intentions toward being an anti-racist, anti-oppressive, multicultural, beloved community. What is really happening, looking inside, that's hard work. And there have been picnics and chalice circles gathering both in person and on Zoom, and long-anticipated emergence into possibly post-pandemic routines. Considering all the uncertainty that Buff and the wider world have continued to ride through, I feel immensely fortunate to be able to return to comparatively smooth waters at a time when there is so much loss and discouragement and so many reasons to throw up our hands and give up on our ideals. It is no mean feat to be able to say, we are hanging in there. We are generous people. We are still people of goodwill and good words and good works. That's still us. There's nothing going to change that. That is no mean feat to hang in there. And I'm not surprised by this. But so much can change so quickly. The religious landscape is changing so quickly. There are enormous challenges and pressures on us. Not just questions of how to stay viable and relevant, but forces that cast doubt on our core principles of our faith tradition, affirming the inherent worth and dignity of every person, believing that the interdependent web of creation is going to somehow hold together, and that there will be a place for all of us. So thank you for keeping the faith. That's no small thing, even one day to the next. Thank you, Buff staff, who undoubtedly had to deal with gaps in expectations that surely someone would be taking care of the things that Paul usually does. And again, thank you to the board, who rather than 2 meetings in March and April had 5, and all that goes with that, all of the complications, and the tech crews, and the canvassers, and the COVID task force, who worked through still one more long winter of uncertainty, been juggling the imperatives of social responsibility and not continuing the spreading of disease, and the imperatives of social engagement and not stopping the spread of love. Over the course of the pandemic, I began to feel more and more disconnected. Even before the pandemic, I largely voluntarily cut off from social media. And while I used to spend a great deal of time tuned into national and international news, the Capitol attack was the last straw for me. Once Biden was sworn in, I stopped listening to the radio and basically just read the Bellingham Herald and glanced through the national news headlines online. At first, I felt so bad about this. There's a wide continuum between knowing what's going on in the world and being drowned by it. Where's the balance? And for 2 years, not being able to see people face to face, such a sense of disconnection that I know many of you have felt. But of course, we have new ways to connect. Zoom in particular, despite its drawbacks, pretty handy sometimes. So there too, a wide range between totally immersed and, when we become discouraged by our limitations, totally removed. Just forget it. And this is not just a linear scale, but this is so multidimensional, all the choices that we make and the choices that are made for us. The rhetoric that we usually use about caring or enthusiasm is we're all in. But we can't be all in to our families and all into our work and all into our health and all into our communities and all into the wider world with all of its miseries and its miracles. The disruptions of the pandemic showed us that we could not be all into any one thing, and certainly not all into everything. And that's felt awful, admitting that. So there's been a lot of recalibration going on, and a lot of that recalibration is going to be helpful, as bad as it feels, as hard as it is to figure out now. And with everyone doing it at the same time, everyone at their own pace, old connections breaking and new connections forming, and new kinds of connections we don't yet have words for, it's been pretty discombobulating. It's an incredible privilege then for me to be able to step away from so much of it, especially since my family, my job, my health have all been pretty stable in the scheme of things. So that's an incredible privilege. So then connection. I still believe that the interdependent web of all creation is a fine way of understanding this interdependent web of all creation. Of course we're all connected. That's the nature of things. But we're not always thrilled about it. Sometimes we're able to choose how close and how strong our connections will be. But in most cases, we're not in control. My biggest question going into the sabbatical were about how Buff can be, or will be, or should be connected, internally and externally, given that we have choices to make. Some choices we are free to make, and some choices we'd rather not make, but we have to. And given that a lot of our connections, our who and our what, and our where and our how, just are, those connections are, nothing we can do about it. This is the world in which we live. So what do we make of that? Put more plainly, my question has been, how can we be relevant? Now that every node on the interdependent web of creation has moved around, or now that everything is moving so fast that it's hard to grasp the potential qualities of our current and possible new connections, what are we going to give our attention to? Is there anything important enough, or any combination of connections that are important enough to us as a whole to be a viable mission? That's the biggest question I had going into sabbatical, and it's the biggest question I have coming out of sabbatical. What's different is that in December I was tired of asking the question. One of the great quotes I came across in my reading this month is by James Baldwin, who said, "The purpose of art is to lay bare the questions that have been hidden by the answers." Purpose of art is to lay bare the questions that have been hidden by the answers. I used to think that that was what made Unitarian Universalism special, that we didn't obscure the questions with predetermined answers. And then I came to appreciate Unitarian Universalism even more when it gave me room to say, a lot of these questions are a waste of time. When I am not at my best, my curiosity goes away. I start to think that all of the questions are a waste of time, which in effect is not much different from having predetermined answers. Either way, it's not much fun. I'm coming back now curious, and that feels good. The truth is, some questions are still a waste of time. They lead us nowhere. They distract us from what matters, disconnect us. But I'm coming back curious. I don't want to blindly pursue la-di-da, whatever trivial questions come up. And I especially don't want us to waste our precious time, each other's precious time, just going on to distracting questions about the most recent irritant or squeaky wheel. I'm curious, and I want to stay curious about the questions that matter. Which ones are they? It's not necessarily the big questions, the abstract, open-ended questions about life. It's sometimes, but not always, the small questions, small, solvable concerns. It's sometimes going to be looking within, and it's sometimes going to be looking without, and it's sometimes going to be just those instantaneous questions like, wow. You've had them, and they're gone. Those are important and unimportant questions in every one of those categories, big and small, answerable and unanswerable. Another great quote that I came across recently that I've already forgotten, which is just as it should be, was from a Buddhist source regarding sculpture. The importance of finding beauty not by adding, but by taking away, carving away, to find out the beauty, to find the art beneath what is essential. So I'm particularly curious, even as we sift and winnow and prioritize, taking away, how might we join our curiosity, mine and yours, and yours, and yours, and especially yours, you people on Zoom. How might our curiosity intersect with the needs and the joys and the griefs and the hope for liberation within and beyond us? How can our curiosity... What? Is that all the time I have? Is that how it works now? Stripping away the superfluous? Wasn't this supposed to be lessons of sabbatical? Like conclusions? No, that's not what we're here for? Huh, that's curious. Well, why don't we sing? Number 354. We laugh, we cry. We laugh, we cry, we live, we die, we dance, we sing our song. We need to feel there's something here to which we can belong. We need
is a benediction? At its root, benediction means saying good. My colleague Susan Manker-Seal puts it more eloquently. She says, much of ministry is a benediction, a speaking well of each other and the world, a speaking well of what we value, honesty, love, forgiveness, trust. A speaking well of our efforts, a speaking well of our dreams. This is how we celebrate life, through the speaking well of it, living the benediction, and becoming as a word well spoken. As Jeff extinguishes the chalice, take a moment, please, to recall a time that someone has spoken to you a word of hope that truly resonated, or a word of encouragement, or comfort, or forgiveness. And commit yourself to living the spirit of that benediction by passing it on to someone who could use your good word today. Amen. And let's sing together. How do we do this? Do we hold hands?
Yes.
Oh, wow. Circle round.